People are literally buying these massive clamshell boxes of spinach and using half pound or more of spinach every day. That is really toxic. I was looking back at this thing that I really love. I wanted to share this with you because I haven't done this on other interviews. We got the notion that plant compounds are great, heroic, anti-inflammatory things that protect you from old age, get in the way of oxidative stress in the body and all this, and it's not how it works at all. I thought I had like 15 things wrong with me, autoimmune diseases, you name it. And it turned out the only thing I really had was oxalate poisoning from being a goody two-shoes and eating great food.
Let's start out talking about what oxalates are and why they matter.
Okay, so oxalates are a chemical set of chemicals. They're called oxalates, plural. There's a parent chemical called oxalic acid, and it's really well known in the field of science and deep science, but it's not well known out here in normal life. And nature makes it. It's in lots of different things, but plants make a lot of it. Soil funguses make a lot of it. And there's a fair amount of oxalic acid in the oxalate salts that it makes, including calcium oxalate crystals that it becomes in plants that we eat. And it's affecting our health in ways that we're oblivious to. And not paying attention to them is making them dangerous.
So far you've said acids, salts, oxalates. We've used a lot of different words, but for the simplicity during our conversation here, does oxalates encapsulate all of that?
It does.
Okay, great.
So there's oxalic acid, and there's two forms of that. Those are oxalates, but really oxalate technically means the salt form. So the acid has a negative charge and it grabs positively charged things like calcium and magnesium and iron and other minerals. And that's technically a salt. So our best example of salt is table salt, which is an ion of chloride and sodium that when dried out turns into a crystal. So the same thing happens with certain acids like oxalic acid that can grab a mineral. When it's dry, it's a white powdery crystal.
All right, we're going to get into a lot of the different top sources in plants where these are coming from. But I think it's important to mention out the door the fact that the body also makes these. So let's talk about when that happens and how that process is normal and it's different from what we're going to get into.
Well, oxalic acid can be a byproduct of chemical processes that are principally happening in the liver, somewhat in the red blood cells, and maybe even a little bit in the kidneys. And that's coming from the breakdown of certain amino acids and happens a lot more. There's these precursor molecules that can be shunted into oxalate. And if you're stressed and you don't have enough B vitamins and too much inflammation and this and that, your system can end up having more oxalate generated from the liver production. It's a fairly small amount, probably from amino acid breakdown. So it could be this stress or breaking down connective tissues in the body. That's these amino acids are your fascia and your tendons and bones and so on, skin. And some amount of the hydroxyproline, for example, is one of these amino acids that can, to a small degree, break down into oxalic acid. And probably less than 6 milligrams a day is coming from breakdown of amino acids in the body. There's another potential source of oxalate in the body. The biggest sort of what we call this endogenous production coming from your metabolism comes from the breakdown of vitamin C. But vitamin C is not an endogenous compound. It's yet again something you must consume as a food or a supplement. And it can get into cells and hang around for cells and degenerate within cells. So vitamin C is a sneaky way to get oxalate into your brain and other tissues because as it's hanging around in cells, it can degenerate. And there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of unknowns about the whole physiology of vitamin C breaking down into oxalates. Some of it is happening with enzyme processes, but by itself, vitamin C sitting in a container can turn into oxalate. So even the supplements you take probably have traces of oxalate in them because the vitamin C so naturally oxidizes into oxalic acid. Oxalate has 4 oxygen molecules attached to 2 carbons. That's the end product of oxidation. And so vitamin C oxidizes and can be turned into oxalic acid.
So when it comes to vitamin C being turned into oxalates in the body or the amino acids, is that just a waste product? Or is there any function in the body? Does the body utilize that in a healthy way? Is there any cases of that?
The only possibility is the concentration of oxalate in the saliva. So the saliva glands put bicarbonate into the saliva to keep your saliva at a neutral pH or around 7 or slightly higher than 7 to protect your teeth from rotting, right? So you've got bicarbonate transporters in your saliva glands. They also move oxalic acid into your saliva. So saliva concentrates oxalate 10 to 30 times higher than what's in the bloodstream. So when you've eaten a lot of oxalate or taken a lot of vitamin C, it could be turning into oxalate in the bloodstream. Anyway, the oxalate levels in your saliva goes up, and that can promote tartar on the teeth. And that coating of the teeth is potentially slightly protective. It creates a patina that helps keep acids from penetrating the teeth. So, but other than that, the body's trying to get rid of the oxalate. It causes a lot of problems and headaches for cells. Yeah, but we're familiar with the compound as a physiological being. The body knows about oxalate. It knows about crystals. It knows about oxalic acid. It has means for moving it around and getting rid of it. But the means are limited. We're really not intended, I think, to be exposed to huge amounts of it. So small amounts of it are fairly neutral, but you get constant exposure and high levels past our capacity for managing it, and it becomes quite a problem.
Right now, 12.5% of the people that are watching these videos are subscribed to the channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a second and do so below. It's going to help the community continue to grow and help the show continue to bring on the biggest guests. Thank you ahead of time. Continue to enjoy this episode with Sally. I want to make sure we really hash out this endogenous piece. And the part I still want to make sure I'm clear on, when it comes to amino acids, is that from proteins that are in the body or proteins that we take in through the diet, or both?
Both. That would be both. So it's in the collagen supplements and gelatin, skin and connective tissue that we eat, but also that's the same. We're basically, when you eat animal connective tissue, we're made of the same connective tissue. And you have to turn over your cellular and other materials in the body, constantly renewing them and maintaining them. Your bones, your tendons, your fascia, cells, your skin, you're constantly making new stuff. And as you're breaking it down and rebuilding it, you have, kind of discard pile. And that is, so for example, the situation would be you just injured yourself, just had surgery, had some kind of physical trauma, you're going to see breakdown of tissue. And with that, you get a release of more of these hydroxyproline and so on, these amino acids that can be, to a small fraction, some fraction of them can become oxalate. And probably the fraction depends on how much inflammation is going on. So the problem with injury and surgery is there's a fair amount of inflammation happening at the same time.
So what this is all slowly uncovering is the fact that the end goal is not to get oxalates down to zero when it comes to diet and endogenous. It's just to lower them to a level that's healthy. And that's going to be an important concept throughout our conversation.
Within our capacity, within our metabolic capacity, we can handle oxalate, and often going to a zero oxalate diet is a mistake for a lot of people. And often, if you are sick because of oxalate, you often have to use a little oxalate in the diet to help manage it.
Well, we're going to get into that, but I think it's important before we do that, we talk about, you mentioned that it causes health complications when we take in too many. Let's talk about that and also some of the top foods that bring oxalate into the body.
Yeah, so the health complications are hard to swallow because it's happening down at the level of the cells and the tissues. It's such a basic level. It blows up into all kinds of things. And I was looking back at this thing that I really love. I wanted to share this with you because I haven't done this on other interviews, but this became a disease problem that was being discussed in medicine in the early 1800s. And by 1840, it had its own diagnosis, the dietary poisoning by oxalates. And this is an article from 1846, a guy named Wilson, and he talks about what they see in the patients with oxalate. And I think it's really fun. So it gives you a sense of the emphasis is on neurotoxicity that's affecting people's personalities and moods. And it was really obvious to these guys because they knew them. They were like fellow elites. They were the young doctors and so on who were getting into trouble with rhubarb. And like, they could go to the little bakery and get rhubarb tarts during rhubarb season, which started at Christmas time because they would force rhubarb. It was this huge fad, like spinach smoothies are now. The rich people who could afford sugar were eating these rhubarb tarts and rhubarb this and pastries and whatever. And so they would know these guys who would suddenly become like negative, irritable, weird. Their personalities would change. So this description talks about the symptoms of oxalate poisoning, and it starts off saying that cases are characterized by depression with great irritability, the more prominent symptoms of which are lowness of spirits. I love this one. Apprehension of impending evil. Okay, that's Eeyore brain, right? Everything in the future is going to be horrible. Irritability of temper, emaciation, fatigue from slight exertion, diminished sexual power, pain, a sense of weight across the loins. Okay, this is pelvic heaviness, and gastric derangements. And then it goes on and says, we often see oxalate crystals in the urine of cases of infection like tuberculosis, in arthritis, in soft bones or osteomalacia, and with skin boils. And they go on and talk about the various skin things and the connection with oxalate in the urine. So interestingly, that pretty covers it. We have the neurotoxicity affecting mood and personality and ability to think, energy levels collapsing. You see digestive problems, connective tissue problems with arthritis and so on, in the skin boils, and then the bones is another connective tissue thing. So you see this kind of triad, plus they're saying loins, heaviness in the loins, that's inflammation happening down there in the bladder region and even the genital region. And so you see the urinary tract affected, the digestive tract affected, the nervous system affected, the connective tissues like the bones and the skin, and you see the immune system affected with this connection with infection.
Wow. So it's far reaching. It basically can affect anything.
Pretty much.
Okay. So the next logical question is somebody tuning in here, and, most people from time to time at least have, some of the different challenges you mentioned there. How do they begin to know if oxalates is at the root of that? Is there some kind of testing we can have done to see our oxalate levels, or how do we go about assessing whether or not that's at the root of the health challenge?
If there was easy, inexpensive, objective measures like blood tests, we would already know about this problem. We would be able to document it, and it wouldn't be such an unusual topic. But that's one reason why we don't know about it. It is hard to test for. The gold standard test in medicine is to take a chip of bone out of your hip and see if you have oxalate accumulating in your bones. And even that is prone to something we call false negatives, where you might missample and get a spot where there's not the oxalates. Maybe all your oxalates are in your neck and not your hip, and you can miss it. And that's not going to happen anyway. No one's going to take out a chip of bone from your hip, so you're safe. Because you have to be a pretty severe case where they're suspecting the genetic form of this condition, because there is a genetic form called primary hyperoxaluria where that internal production in liver is off the charts because of damage to the way where the enzymes are in the cells and so on, and enzymes that are broken, you can't make them properly and so on. There's all these different forms of mutations that has this effect of now the liver and cells are producing way too much oxalate. So I'm losing track of my
No, we're just trying to get to the bottom of somebody who is suffering with one of the symptoms that you mentioned there, or I'm sure that's just a sample. There's probably others as well. How do we begin to uncover whether oxalates is part of our health challenge?
I have created what they do in toxicology, which is look at exposure levels and look at symptom patterns. So on my website and in the book, there's a self-assessment where you can look at your history of using high oxalate foods. You can look at your patterns of symptoms, and you can think about your risk factors, because the degree, the quickness to which oxalates may affect your health and show up as symptoms could be a product of how well your gut is or is not able to handle controlling the absorption rate, how much can gets in your bloodstream, and how well your kidneys are excreting them. So if you've been on a lot of NSAIDs or antibiotics, that's going to harm your kidneys and your gut and your liver to the extent that it could affect your susceptibility, like you may become a hyperabsorber of oxalate. And hyperabsorber means a lot more gets from your food into your blood than should, and that can be 4 or 5 times the expected normal absorption rate. And that means you don't even need a high oxalate diet. So if you look at your risk factors, if you've had a history of a lot of NSAIDs or irritable bowel or celiac or any kind of digestive disorder, of which oxalate can play a major role in the development and severity of those problems, that in itself is something to be concerned about. A history of bariatric surgery creates a malabsorptive condition where you don't absorb nutrients well, but you absorb toxins more easily. So it damages all that whole protective system. So if you've had bariatric surgery, you should absolutely be on a low oxalate diet from the get-go, from before you had your surgery. Unfortunately, a lot of patients don't know about that. So look at risks like history of drug use, but your gastric well-being and your kidney function matter a lot. If you've had a history of eating these foods over time, that's inevitably going to cause trouble. And then if you see this pattern of symptoms showing up that affect one of these systems, if you have bad sleep and so on, then there's a connection for people. The thing is, you don't necessarily do this with other toxins. You don't say, well, I'll wait to see if I'm vulnerable to mercury before I question whether I should put mercury fillings in my mouth. But people want to do this with oxalate because it's in foods we trust, and we don't want to change our paradigm about what's okay to eat. And we don't want to break our love affair with the concept that these foods that are high in oxalate are sweet and benign and love us and are great for us in any quantity.
Well, I think it's important before we move forward here, we talk about some of the top foods. For people tuning into the video, they can see your book cover back there and get a basic idea of some of them.
Spinach and chard.
A couple of the top ones there. So let's talk about what the top foods are that people want to be aware of.
Spinach, chard, and beet greens are off the chain high in oxalate and pretty bioavailable. Nuts like almonds, cashews, and peanuts, big problem. They're very used in large quantities. Black and white beans, bran, turmeric, a lot of seeds like chia and hemp, beets, sweet potatoes. I really messed myself up making sweet potatoes my daily starch. So our daily bread was my sweet potato. Oh man, that was a mistake. And the one nobody wants to hear about is cacao or dark chocolate or cocoa powder, being very absorbable, used widely in science because you can easily get a volunteer to come in and drink some hot cocoa or eat a piece of chocolate and then see what the oxalate does in the body. So it's very clear that that's bioavailable oxalate and gets into the body beautifully and shows up in the urine and so on.
Well, let's get really practical with people because that's a lot of different foods you've named there. And a lot of them are going to appear in, different recipes and eating at a friend or family member's house, which comes back to the point I made early on, the fact that the goal isn't to get down to zero. So with the foods you just mentioned, the ones that are highest in oxalate, should the average person be totally avoiding those? Or how do we go about changing our diet in a practical way?
Well, I think depending on how severely you're trying to protect your health and your family's health, what you define as practical is a personal thing. And wanting to just blend in with today's food fads is a risky behavior. But if you look at your biology and what the science is telling us, the science tells us we can handle about 150 milligrams of oxalate a day, which is about 50 per meal, which is about 5 spinach leaves.
Per meal.
Baby spinach leaves per meal, 5 spinach leaves. Whereas people are literally buying these massive clamshell boxes of spinach and using half pound or more of spinach every day. That is really toxic.
Well, the trouble with all this is, the title of your book is Toxic Superfoods. We've been told not only are these foods okay, but these are the healthy foods we should be eating. So it's a real paradox.
It's a real crime, actually, that we're ignoring science we've had for a long time. We've known that spinach chelates calcium and can cause calcium deficiency, particularly in infants and children, and absolutely should not be used for children. And yet, right from the get-go, people from the medical society said, well, we'll just ignore that because the other greens are fine. And so we'll just pretend that's not happening. And we've been basically getting a very skewed picture of things. And then in more recent times, somebody put out this idea in the 80s that these compounds in petri dishes have these anti-inflammatory effects. And we got the notion that plant compounds are great, heroic, anti-inflammatory things that protect you from old age and get in the way of oxidative stress in the body and all this. And it's not how it works at all. And so we've built this into our culture thinking that these phytonutrients are great, and nobody's warned us about the science we've had for 100 years. It keeps getting reconfirmed many times over that oxalic acid is a serious anti-nutrient that causes calcium deficiency and causes electrolyte disturbance in ways that can cause long-term serious health consequences. And we knew in 1840 that you eat too much rhubarb and it makes you sick. This should be common knowledge, and it's not.
Well, coming back to that story of the rhubarb gets me thinking about how the food industry has changed so much more recently, where we have access now to these high oxalate foods 24/7, 365, versus before when we had more seasonality with what we had access to. So naturally, I would assume there'd be periods of time throughout the year where we would have lower oxalates in the diet and give our body a chance to clear out if we've accumulated. Whereas now we can just go and get spinach, every day at Whole Foods and keep hammering it into our green smoothies and never give our body a break and keep accumulating.
Everywhere. And you don't even have to go to Whole Foods. You go to a convenience store at a gas station and you can get green stuff in jars. You can get iced tea, which is another one I didn't mention. You can get peanuts in little packages. You can get all kinds of things and now like the little snack bars and stuff, they're loaded with hemp and chia and all these seeds and stuff, and chocolate is in everything. I mean, try to find an ice cream flavor without chocolate in it. Like, it's everywhere. And absolutely, it was about 50 years ago when here in the US, the 24-hour grocery store became the thing, and you could shop any time of day and start getting things from all over the world, even 50 years ago. That's the whole point of the railroad system and the interstate highways, is to be able to move these agricultural products around because agriculture is so central to economies.
So you gave us the baseline there. I think you said it was 150 milligrams that we want to have as our maintenance on a daily basis. Keep our oxalates below that. Is that correct, the number?
Right. That's what the science seems to indicate, what the renal handling, that is how well the kidneys can manage it and get it out of the body. 150 to 200 pretty much is where kidney capacity is, which doesn't address the capacity of your gastrointestinal tract or your liver, because it goes from your mouth to your stomach, and right away it's starting to get into your bloodstream in the stomach and the upper intestines is where a lot of it starts absorbing into the blood. And all that circulation that's taking care of your stomach and intestines goes straight to the liver. Everything that comes from your food has to go to liver for being processed. And, vitamins are picked up and stored, and things are detoxed and handled. But with oxalate, oxalic acid is the primary one. The calcium oxalate crystals are mostly just abrasive and damaging to tissue, but don't get directly into the blood. What gets in there is oxalic acid, and it goes straight to your liver. It uses up glutathione because the liver has to protect itself. It can't detox oxalate. You do not detox oxalate. The liver, remember, makes oxalate. So the blood that leaves your liver is not lower in oxalate from what you absorbed. It's higher in oxalate. And that blood goes straight up from the liver, an inch, past the diaphragm to the heart. Then the blood goes straight from your liver to your heart, key organs, to your lungs to pick up oxygen, back to your heart again. And this is all full-blown high oxalate after every meal. And if you eat peanut butter on whole wheat toast for breakfast and have some kind of spinach salad for lunch and have sweet potatoes for dinner and chocolate ice cream for dessert, you've nailed yourself 4 times a day. in your liver and your heart and your lungs and your circulatory system. And then eventually the kidneys get a crack at taking it out of the blood.
And we know that symptoms can be far reaching and this can affect all the different tissues in the body. But as you went through that pathway, liver to heart to lungs, circulation, kidney, are those the top tissues that we see are affected by this? And then it kind of just dissipates from there?
Well, we definitely see gastrointestinal issues. So that's happening even before it gets into your bloodstream, where it's being um, affecting the inner surface of your digestive tract. And then there's your nervous system being affected. The liver effects are really kind of hidden. But what I think is happening is that some of us end up more and more over time sensitive to chemicals because our liver can't handle the chemicals as well. We're not able to handle our booze very well. And that's a sign of liver stress. And an oxalate could be really draining your liver of its antioxidant powers because it's protecting itself from your spinach and your sweet potato and your dark chocolate gorging, which is very fashionable right now, that you can just turn dark chocolate into anything now, and cocoa powder, and mix it up with almond butter and sweet potatoes and call it a brownie, and really concentrate this oxalate and eat it over and over again and show other people how to do it and give it to your children. This is the reason it's important for the message to get out, because people have completely unaware that the oxalates they're lingering is a problem.
I want to keep coming back to the practical aspect and how people can adopt what we're talking about today into their own healthy lifestyle. And coming back to that 150 to 200 milligrams a day, given that things like vitamin C and even some amino acids we're taking in, plus vegetables, are going to have oxalates, plus there's the body making oxalates through the breakdown of tissues. How do we go about assessing that in a way with any form of reliability?
Assessing our degree of toxicity?
Well,
Is that what
staying
you
within
mean?
the level of 150 to 200, because there is so much variability. If somebody's taking, and again, we have control over most of these, like, vitamin C intake, if we're taking that as a supplement, and the amino acids, that would get a bit more tricky trying to, calculate how many we've taken in, and then with the vegetables, and then with tissue, you mentioned tissue breakdown and how that adds to the oxalate burden. So when we're talking about 150 to 200, does that include the tissue breakdown as well, or is that just dietary?
That's a really great question. And the thing is, there's no really honest, precise number, right? Because of all these variables, as you suggest, and all the genetic differences, the differences of age. Like, children can't handle near the amount that adults can because their kidneys don't clear it as well. So depending on your state of health and what else is going on at the moment, how much you tolerate in the short run, the bigger question is, could we just acknowledge that certain foods absolutely blow apart our basic fundamental tolerance and just simplify it? Because in the real practical world, sometimes all you have to do is stop eating spinach and almonds, and your arthritis goes away, and your sleep gets better, and your energy gets better, and your life starts working better. And that's, for some people, that's good enough. You just need to know that you might be feeling horrible, and it might be because of the green smoothie that you are using to feel less horrible.
It's so easy to layer them on. I mean, we talk about almonds. We could be using an almond milk in the smoothie, putting, the greens, so putting in the spinach and adding a little bit of turmeric to get the anti-inflammatory, and add some berries, some, blackberries and raspberries. It goes on and on. You can
And
just
some
have
peanut butter
and some some peanut butter in there too.
or
So it can
almond
be,
butter.
it can just be this bomb of oxalates hitting your body. I can only imagine the number if we were to take all that and calculate. And
It
the
can get
irony
to
in
be
all
a
of this is
thousand.
this is supposedly a healthy, coming back to our point from before, this is supposed to be somebody that, well, it is somebody that is making quote unquote a good decision, and going out of their way to pick these ingredients at the grocery store and put them together and eat thoughtfully to try and rectify health issues and stay healthy. So there's just such a paradox to all of this, and I just feel for people trying to navigate.
It's so unfair. It violates my sense of fairness, because those of us who are trying to eat well are making all this expense of time, effort, and thought and energy going into it, thinking we're doing ourselves some good. And it might seem okay in the short run, but when things start unraveling, you never suspect your favorite sweet potato, in my case, or your green smoothie, or your almond habit, or your secret chocolate habit, or it might just be a secret potato chip habit, because potatoes are but we can be doing stuff and never, I think, to me, it's just disturbing because it's so unfair, because we're listening to the messages of the day, being good kids, doing what we're supposed to do to be responsible to our health. And no one's warning us that that's actually doesn't work.
Well, the other challenge to all this too is the fact that different people that are influential in the health world are saying different things. So this is one message from Sally where we're avoiding oxalates, but then, I've had so many different experts on the show over the years saying to avoid this and that, this and that. We start layering all these on top of each other, and it's like, what do people do? So that's another whole layer. I mean, lectins, we have Dr. Gundry on here a number of times talking about lectins, avoiding those. And then again, the whole paradox is not just saying some of these things are neutral, but some people say things like polyphenols are advantageous and we want to get as many as we can. And then in your book, you're saying no polyphenols. So I just feel again for people, and all I can do is bring different information to light and try and sort it for myself, and people can experiment and see what works for them and what resonates. But the mixed messaging is another whole layer to the complication of trying to figure this out.
I 100% squarely are right there with you. And I never really wanted to be in the space of like, eat this, don't eat that, don't eat this. Like never. I mean, I was an academic. That's an easy way to cop out, and not have to take a public stand on what's true or not and not be wrong in public. And I've been wrong plenty in the past because I was a vegetarian and a vegan, and teaching in the public sphere, turning elderly lunch programs into like veggie-based, plant-based stuff years ago before it was a thing. I have blood on my hands. I was wrong. And I paid the price personally. And then I did all this research and I'm working with people. And honest to God, rubber hits the road in the real world. And if you experiment with this in your real life, truth starts to reveal itself and you find yourself feeling like you're unmoored, because our culture is so bent on thinking plants are safe and benign that it's really uncomfortable for people. And that social psychological dissonance keeps people afraid to question these rudimentary beliefs that are completely, it's like, I think of it as like mold hyphae in our heads. Like we're so embedded in this thinking that we're trapped emotionally.
You quickly touched on your story there, the fact you were plant-based and had your own health challenges given that diet and your health journey at that point. Let's get into that. Let's talk about your diet over the years and when you hit a wall with your health and then what you've done to pivot.
Well, I was a goody two-shoes little kid. I love my vegetables and fruits, and we were from a cook-at-home family, and my grandfather was really crazy into fruits and cooked beautiful pastries, and Mom had apple trees and cherry trees and rhubarb and green beans growing in the yard. And my sister and I used to play with the rhubarb and eat it. Rhubarb is insanely high in oxalates, right? And my mom would make rhubarb crisp, and I would get as much as you could with a family of 7 people. I would make sure I got the rhubarb. I love these kinds of high oxalate foods. And I already was having problems as a kid. I had ear infections and strep infections. I might have been born with oxalate poisoning, as far as I know. Had my tonsils out. By kindergarten, I was into nutrition and preaching, we're supposed to do this, we're supposed to do that, because I really wasn't interested in being sick. I wanted to be perky and healthy and free of pain and no more ear infections, because then you can't go in a swimming pool when you have ear infection, and that ruins a child's life, right? It's not good. So, by 7th grade, I had decided to study nutrition. And at that same age, I was starting to get back pain and issues. And then in college, I got this foot problem that did not quit. And I ended up being told I was just to take lots of ibuprofen and that they didn't know what's wrong with me. And I did eventually get off the drugs and the orthotics and sort of recovered from the surgery and all this stuff, but it was really devastating to spend my 20s. I had to take a long leave of absence from Cornell, where I got my nutrition degree, and I never could learn to dance. I had to give up any hopes of playing racquetball or ultimate frisbee or doing normal stuff. Luckily, I discovered yoga, and that saved my ability to have some kind of physical life. And then, things got worse. I developed chronic back problems that didn't quit, and fatigue, severe fatigue all through my 30s. And when I quit being vegan, I added the sweet potato as my starch, because the reason I quit is because I could no longer tolerate beans and wheat. It was making me wiped out and giving me boils on my skin, and I didn't know why. And after I put in the sweet potato in my diet, I developed some other weird things, including lots of wrinkles on my face, like all these little crow's feet, and this little growth on my head, and little age spots. I didn't know what they were. Big knot in my back near the rhomboids by the shoulder blades that at night would just really ache and make it hard to sleep. I never associated that with adding sweet potatoes in, but later on, fast forward, I'm 49 years old, and I finally get serious that I need the slow oxalate diet because I had had an attack of vulvar pain in 2009, and that clued me in that somebody thinks oxalates, this kidney problem that we put kidney patients on, somehow oxalates related to vulvar pain and pelvic problems and connective tissue problems. I have connective tissue problems. I don't have kidney stones. Like, this doesn't make sense to me. So it took me a while to figure this out. But finally, at 49, I realized that my lifetime of arthritis, I started getting arthritis as a 12-year-old and have had it so bad during my vegetarian years. It was terrible. My fingers would swell up. Every joint except my spine would show up with arthritis. One time I couldn't turn the key in the doorknob because I didn't have the strength to turn a key. I was 19 years old. So here I am, 49, fast forward 30 years, and it's like, holy cow, you mean all that horrible arthritis was from my healthy food? I was like, oh crap. I did not want to do the slow oxalate diet because I had the sleep disorder at this point. My brain was waking up 29 times an hour, and I was sure I must have some form of SIBO and endotoxemia causing the sleep disorder. So I was trying to deal with that. And now I'm like, wait, I don't want to do this arthritis thing because I got this sleep thing. Like, I was not happy about arthritis and oxalates and having to do that. So I did it. And I was 10 days later now reading the mail. My brain was turning back on. I could tell my sleep was getting better. And all kinds of things started going away. And then by the following June, I was wearing heels for 8.5 hours, 7.5 hours at a wedding. And I'm like, why am I not in agony? Why am I in these heels? How did I do? I've never been able to do that, ever. And so I was like, I thought I had like 15 things wrong with me, autoimmune diseases, you name it. And it turned out the only thing I really had was oxalate poisoning from being a goody two-shoes and eating great food.
Well, this oxalate message, even with you and putting your book out here and spreading the message, is still relatively unknown. So what in 2009, who was talking about this? How did you figure it out?
Yes, praise be to Joanne Yant, who founded the Vulvar Pain Foundation about 31 years ago. And these gals who suffered with this vulvar pain, it's unbelievably debilitating. They can't sit. Sometimes you can't walk. Like, it's so bad. I mean, it is evil pain. And they do things like they cut out the glands at the opening of the vagina. Then they take a laser and they laser off the surface of the vulva. And then they do it again and again. They don't have any treatments for it. And she hooked up with a guy. She was amazing. And they tested her urine and found high oxalate spikes in her urine. And they decided we should try to control oxalate exposure. And lo and behold, it took care of the vulvar pain. And then her fibromyalgia cleared up and her connective tissues cleared up. And she founded this foundation and has this website. And so when I had my vulvar pain attack, which was only 3 days, like, I don't even begin to know what they suffer with. I could only take it for 3 days. And I was like ready to have like a genital ectomy. Like, I don't want this to happen. And so she clued me in, but I didn't understand. And her knowledge wasn't what I have managed to pull together really deeply studying the literature. So it didn't explain this bioaccumulation problem that I could go off my sweet potatoes and sort of feel okay, but whatever, then it didn't really make a difference. And then I added sweet potatoes back in again, and that I didn't feel bad from eating them when I put them back in. And what I didn't understand is the body has a body store now. We actually are all building up oxalate in our bones, in our thyroid glands, in tendons, our kidneys, and we all die with a condition called nephrocalcinosis, which is diffuse oxalate crystals all through our kidneys. And you can live fine and have this and just die with crystally kidneys. You can have a placenta full of crystals and no one says anything about it. You can have fat buildup full of crystals and nobody tells you that your crystals are full of oxalate in your fat. Like, it's not discussed, so you don't know what's happening. And so she didn't understand this bioaccumulation. And it's very important to know about it, because when I went on my low oxalate diet and I got really maniacal, like I'm not eating the enemy, I was not necessarily always feeling well. That's because I'm full of oxalate. And once you've quit eating that, the body's like, finally, it's winter. Finally, we're out of the rhubarb patch. Finally, we can get it out of the thyroid gland or the kidneys. And that brings on inflammation and more symptoms. So you don't know if you're feeling better on the diet. And you don't, when you add back in your sweet potatoes, it tends to turn off that inflammation of the oxalate clean out process. And then you feel better when it stops doing that. And so you think, well, oxalates aren't my problem. And you're wrong. So I was wrong about that too.
So when it comes to the vulvar pain, is it actually crystals building up in the tissue that cause the pain? Like, do
I
they
wish
know the
we
physiology and the anatomy and mechanism, what's happening there? Because, I mean, as you're telling the story, that's what I'm picturing, because we're talking about these oxalate crystals as part of the story, and it sounds painful, but do they know exactly what's happening?
They don't, because it's little old Joanne. She doesn't run an institute at NIH. She doesn't run a university lab. She's not respected in literature and science. And so all of us, probably hundreds of thousands of women who occasionally get crotch pain, and men too. This could be scrotal pain. It can be any kind of, remember heaviness in the loins, like inflammation in the loins, that's the genitals and the pelvis, is a problem with oxalates and has been for all of human history. And science doesn't seem to know that. And so they haven't been interested in the mechanism. They're only interested in trying to discredit the one paper that Dr. Solomons wrote. He was the one who worked with Joanne Yon, who founded the Vulvar Pain Foundation. So they try to discredit the connection between vulvodynia and oxalates and have shown no curiosity, which is fairly irresponsible from the viewpoint of us who have hurt ourselves on the high oxalate diet.
So coming back to your story, it sounded like within, I think you said 10 days when you went on a low oxalate diet, you started to have symptom relief. How quickly did things start to turn around for you?
Yeah, it was pretty clear once I really knew what I was doing and did it really well, that things were shifting in my body. And it took me a long time to recognize other things that were getting better. The whole healing process can be a lifetime. You can have oxalate crystals embedded in your spinal discs like I probably do. I'm sure all of my vertebral bodies are full. I know my thyroid has struggled mightily with oxalate in them. And you can create an inflammatory condition because nanocrystals in tissues is very inflammatory. Any nanoparticulate, think about asbestosis, where you breathe in nanofibers. That turns on inflammation in lungs that can kill you, and you need a lung transplant to survive that if you survive. This is what's happening, not just in lung tissues, happening anywhere that nanocrystals of oxalate are forming and getting stuck in tissues. And the longer you maintain the high oxalate diet, the more of this particulates are forming in the body. The confusing part is that the body's so clever that it tries to wrap these crystals up in ways where they don't have any symptoms, right? So the body is protecting you from it. So you can have absolutely no symptoms and be loading yourself with oxalate problems. And we see this in the primary hyperoxaluria literature, where people's oxalate are coming from the genetic defect. they often have very little symptoms for a long time. Not so much with the newborn infants that are expressing the disease right at the point of birth. They'll usually, if they find out within the first 3 to 6 months, that baby rarely lives to past about 14 months old from oxalate poisoning. But others will show up in midlife, even 50 years old, and have the only symptom they show up with is neck pain, shoulder issues, dental pain, sinus problems, all kinds of things that can be just oxalates and not know it. So the body's busy protecting us from nano and micro particles that can be forming in our tissues, and you don't know it. So by the time you're 49 and getting rid of your sweet potatoes and your chard, you have decades of doing rhubarb. And I was a vegetarian and a vegan. I was into beans and stuff like that, full of the lectins. And Dr. Gundry is not wrong about lectins. Lectins are trouble. And just a little, hats off to Dr. Gundry. I, from Cornell, did not know that you're supposed to soak your beans for 3.5 days and then pressure cook them in order to disarm lectins in beans. I didn't know that going to Cornell. You take 6 or 7 hours of food labs, and you don't learn this in food labs. You learn how to make a gluten ball. You learn some really stuff that seems esoteric. You don't learn that beans should be properly prepared because of the lectins in them. So you can't trust people with PhDs and MPHs and bachelors in science and nutrition, because what we're learning in school is missing so much information about the plant compounds that are causing trouble. We're not in academia curious enough about the Joannes and the Sallys of the world. Why do they solve unsolvable modern maladies by just switching a few foods around?
You brought up a really interesting point there when you're talking about lectins and soaking the beans. It gets me thinking about oxalates. Given what we know about these foods that contain them, are there different preparation methods such as soaking, cooking, fermenting, things we can do to still eat some of these foods, or at least in moderation, but knock that oxalate content down in the food before we eat it?
There's not enough research on this, but the general answer is no. The reason why oxalates are like the worst of the plant chemicals is there's not a good way to get away from them other than separating them out from the food. So if you turn turmeric, whole root turmeric, into curcumin extract, you've removed all the oxalate. Okay. You turn a potato into potato starch, you've removed all the oxalate. You turn peanuts into peanut oil, you've removed all the oxalate in the oil, because it's a water-soluble charged molecule that goes with the polar water and is repelled by the non-polar fats. So you don't see it in fats. So there's ways to separate it out. You take whole grains and you turn them into white flour, and that's way lower in oxalate. So you get rid of the bran and you remove the parts that have the oxalate. The one thing you can do with the soluble oxalate in broccoli and a couple of vegetables is boil them pretty well and throw out the water. And that'll leach out maybe half of the oxalates, a third, depends on how much boiling. We're not going to come by with a science lab and test your broccoli pre and post, but boiling broccoli helps to revive broccoli as something you can play around with in kind of massive doses-ish. It's a little bit higher than like cabbage is very low in oxalate, but picking foods that are naturally low in oxalate is the easiest thing to do, most sensible thing to do. But you can use things like curcumin to season your curry and not give up on the curry flavor. So you don't give up on anything, but it asks you to cook at home.
What about certain supplements or foods that we combine when we're having some oxalates in other foods to help dampen the effect? Is there anything in that realm?
Well, calcium is the main binder of oxalate. We take calcium supplements to help the body remove oxalate. You can eat dairy foods with your diet, which is a good idea. And that will reduce oxalate absorption 20 to 30, 40, sometimes more percent. And there's such a mix of factors in a person's individual biology and that particular meal and diet generally. It's hard to say, but it's not a total slam dunk. You're still, as I mentioned in the book, they're seeing renal damage in children on almond milk. And that has fortified with calcium. And that calcium did not protect the children from getting oxalate damage from drinking almond milk.
When you talk about almonds, it gets me thinking about the fact that they're so pervasive in today's quote unquote healthy eating world. I mean, having almonds as a snack, we talked about almond milk and there's almond flour. So it's just, the stuff can hit you from so many different angles.
I think it starts to hit people when they decide to go gluten-free, and often they go dairy-free at the same time. So they take away the protective calcium when they remove dairy. So now they're in much more danger of high absorption rates. They've already got a gut problem, so they're hyperabsorbers anyway. So if you have a gut problem and no dairy, you're going to just like open the floodgates and have a lot more oxalate get into your body. And then because you're gluten-free, you're now going for almond flour, quinoa, buckwheat, teff. These are really high oxalate foods. So you've gone from the fire into hell. Like, this is not a good thing. And so that's where people, I think, really, they start going, oh, I got to do something about my gut or my health. And they start going for this. And that's kind of how I just figured out oxalates were causing my arthritis, is I was trying to fix the gut problems that I thought were causing the sleep problems. So I was eating kiwi that's supposed to help with your constipation. So the solution became the problem that revealed to me the connection between oxalates and my arthritis, because by adding 2 kiwi a day for a few months, my arthritis came back with a vengeance, and I got all stiff and tight and was aging really fast on 2 kiwis a day. And that, in the suffering, I took a moment and paused and thought, oh my God, it's the oxalate in the kiwi.
That was 4 years later in 2013, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So what we're all learning, as you explain here, is that pretty much it seems like all plant foods have some level of oxalates. And why I'm coming to this is because, again, coming to that 150, 200 milligram number, you talked about broccoli, kiwi, you talked about, teff and buckwheat, and it goes on and on. So how much are in some of these other foods? Again, we can come back to the top foods you named earlier on, but do we need to, in a practical sense, keep track of all these secondary ones too? Like, I'm just wondering how quickly some of these secondaries can add up and get us to that 150 or 200 milligrams.
They definitely can add up. That's really true. And it's been surprising to me. There's both the phenomenon of people get rid of the top 3 offenders and they feel really great for it, because I think that's the place to start. And as your body starts, that really improves the body's ability to cope and heal. But the deeper you heal your kidney function and so on, the better the body gets at removing oxalate. That can cause additional sickness. But I have had some people who really didn't get the full benefit of paying attention to oxalate until they cut out the spicy foods. They had to cut out the Ethiopian and the Mexican and stuff. There's just enough oxalate in irritation and other metabolic effects. It's hard to isolate just oxalate with something like spices because they're affecting your nervous system, and you literally can turn on endorphins eating hot pepper. So there's lots of different metabolic effects, but she gave up the endorphin-inducing hot food that she was so committed to for years. And she was one of these people who would special order pepper potato chips, the black pepper ones that you couldn't get in the stores in the day. And she was really into spices. And it was when she gave up her spice habit that really gave her the pain breakthrough that she needed. So you have to play around. If you're not getting the results you want, you have to keep learning. And that's the whole method, really, is just, okay, hit a few worst offenders for a while, play around with that and how it changes your life, get used to that just so your life keeps working normally, and keep coming back and learning what other foods have oxalate, where are the medium oxalate foods. You just have to come back over and over and over it to you're deep in your awareness. If you attempt to learn it all at once, it'll just be, I think, a big muddle in your head and big disruption in your life.
You mentioned top 3 oxalate foods. I want to make sure we're highlighting what those are. I'm guessing spinach is one. We've mentioned rhubarb being up there. What are the top 3?
Well, the top 3 are the ones that you eat. If you never touch almonds or rhubarb, that doesn't mean you don't have a problem with some other food that's high in oxalate. Some people get into like beets and they're doing kvass and pickled beets and beet soup and beet this. Like, you can get into any particular food. It can just be one food in your diet that is your worst offender. For some people, that's chocolate. It's different for each person. Some people get, really hooked on potatoes, and it's their potato habit that's doing it. So it doesn't matter like mathematically what's the worst offenders. What matters is which of the high oxalate foods have you relied on as a staple and a friend? Which ones are you trusting? And is there any amongst of that little crew of trusted foods that you're willing to I could live without you, darling, and have a little breakup?
Well, that's a good point. It depends on what you're consuming, but to make sure people aren't consuming when it comes to the specific numbers, the top three, what are the top three with numbers that just blow the rest out of the water?
Are those three greens, the chard, the beets, and the spinach. But you could call chard and beets exactly the same vegetable because they are. Botanically, chard is a beet with no beet on the end of it. So they're both worse than spinach. So that would be, and to me, saying you don't have to eat chard and spinach should be like, holiday. Woohoo, let's not mess with that. That's a way to simplify.
So for somebody who is tuned into this point and they want to start getting practical in their own life and start decreasing some of these top offenders, let's go through what the journey would look like. So we're cutting the top offenders out. We're continuing to learn what different oxalate foods are and lessen them in the diet. Let's talk about the physiology at that point as people begin to cut down, the dumping from the tissues, and let's get into the nuances of how that works.
Well, no one's really studied this in any systematic way. It's actually in mainstream science. They're not aware of this phenomenon, which is pretty amazing to those of us watching it happen in real lives, because there's this fad kind of idea in medicine that you have to have renal failure before you have oxalate accumulation. So they think it only happens in a subset. 3% of people are in renal failure, so therefore barely 3% of people have oxalate accumulations, when they've never, they have really very little to stand on with that theory, but they keep repeating it in literature. So they're all just thinking that way without actually paying attention to it's quite the opposite. 85% of us have oxalate crystals in our thyroid gland by the time we're 50. 85% of us do not have renal failure. That should be so blatantly obvious that they should be curious about it, but they're not. That's not how funding works. And these days, in the last 30 years or so or more, science gets lauded when it's understanding physiological mechanisms and how we can interfere with them with the drug. And so we want to understand physiological mechanisms because we can get in there and interrupt certain processes in the body with the drug, rather than understanding what's the root cause of this disarray we see in, say, inflammatory and autoimmune conditions. So the science isn't really there, except that we see it, and we see it in real life. But what is in the science is several studies. It's a very small set of studies that shows that if you don't keep taking what you call a maintenance dose and don't do these trigger doses, then you stop the accumulation in the body, and the body can start deaccumulating oxalate.
Let's break that apart and talk about what a trigger dose would be, maintenance, and then clearing.
So the definition of a trigger dose is the amount of oxalate it takes to stimulate the formation of a brand new oxalate deposit somewhere in the body. And it kind of looks like a trigger dose only has to double the oxalate levels in your urine, which is about 1.5 ounces of chocolate. We'll do that.
Wow. So 1.5 ounces of chocolate would be enough to be a trigger dose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So it doesn't take much.
It doesn't take much.
Let's define what a trigger, go into the nuance more of what a trigger dose is versus maintenance, because there's some science in your book talking about how to get the ball rolling with all this accumulation, you need to have a trigger dose. And once that happens, then you can start accumulating, the way I understand it, through more of a maintenance dose.
Right. So the maintenance dose is some amount less than that. And how, there's so little science. This is based on doing studies with rats. It really isn't that ethical to give someone a trigger dose and then biopsy their tissues or whatever. You need to then dissect you in different parts and see where the oxalate is. And in order to do that, you'd have to use a radioactive dose to show that radioactive chocolate, so they've been able to do that with the rats, but it's pretty tough to translate into direct human studies to give you like this precision of, but if it only takes a small portion of chocolate to do that much of an increase of oxalate in the body that turns on this triggering process, because where the accumulation happens in the body, which we haven't talked about, I just think is useful to just think about this for a second. It triggers accumulation because there's more hanging around in the tissues. It's fine. It's in the bloodstream. Down in capillary beds, there's high pressure pushing oxygen, nutrients, and oxalate into your tissues. It could be your eyeball, your cheekbone, your ear, whatever. And if there's something going on in those tissues, especially if there's some inflammation, infection, injury, that's going to make it harder for the cells in those tissues to repel the oxalate that's being pushed at them after meals. So that's where you get the triggers setting up where you've got injury, infection, and it could be that the oxalate just injured the tissue right there in your gut. Maybe the crystal injured the tissue and then you've got oxalic acid right there, boom. There isn't a lot of documentation of oxalates in the gut. It's a turning over tissue, but there's a lot of traffic back and forth. But so you're going to get this trigger accumulation in some place, something you used all day. So maybe you typed all day and then had chocolate for dessert, and then at night you high oxalate overnight because it takes 4 hours or 10 hours for oxalate to get out of your gut and out through your kidneys. You're going to have this triggering happening at different times of day under different circumstances. And so it's idiosyncratic when and where it shows up, but it's going to be somewhere in your body. Then the next day you just eat regular food, like a maintenance dose. What is it? I don't know. Is it 30 milligrams of oxalate? That's an extra big iced tea.
So to summarize what you're saying here, you need a trigger dose, which is basically nothing. I mean, I probably have a trigger dose on a regular basis, eating healthy, quote unquote, chocolate. And then a maintenance dose because of that accumulation from the trigger dose in a different area of the body where there was likely a previous injury or the tissue has been recently used heavily. The trigger dose is going to accumulate there, the oxalates. And then the next day you're having just a moderate amount of oxalates, which is like basically nothing. And then because you've had that trigger dose and then the accumulation start, it's going to further facilitate problems in that area with a maintenance dose.
That's right, because the body's response to the trigger and the accumulation would be to get rid of it. But it can't get rid of it because the maintenance dose tells the body, well, the kidneys and the body is busy with this other oxalate, so we can't move this toxic piece because there's another toxic piece in the way. So the maintenance dose is getting in the way of the body's desire to get rid of that accumulation.
And it sounds like it's a real chicken and egg thing with the inflammation, because the oxalates tend to go to areas that are inflamed in the body, but when they go there, they cause inflammation. So you can see how it's just a cycle that's going to feed itself. Plus, you mentioned the fact that oxalates in and of themselves can cause inflammation. So it's like a lot of different variables and things happening with that.
Well, you get this progressive problem. Like my feet just wouldn't get better. They just wouldn't until I was almost 50. I turned 50. Now that oxalate's finally out of the way, that long frustrated attempt to have healthier connective tissues in my feet was now successful. But in the meantime, my maintaining a high oxalate diet meant the connective tissues were never good in my feet and maintained pain. But you basically, if you have old stuff that kind of lingers and never fully resolves, this could be why.
Well, let's talk about that third category where somebody is really lowering oxalates. They're going to start clearing them out of tissues where they've been building up. How low do they have to go? We know 30 milligrams is maintenance. How low do we have to go to start expelling what we've accumulated?
Well, this is where there's absolutely no math that fits every human being on the planet. It seems that whatever plane you're on now, your body's doing the best it can to manage that plane. So if you're eating 1,000 milligrams at breakfast with a green smoothie and then having another 200 with lunch and another 500 with dinner, your body is in the most defensive mode it can be. It's in the sequestration metabolism. So it's trying to limit absorption and it's trying to pull it out of the bloodstream so the blood isn't constantly toxic. So you're really loading up in that state. And sometimes it just takes cutting out the smoothie could be enough. And then the body's like, because it's desperately overloaded. You can think of an old rickety cart of too much fruit in the back of it. It's so over top heavy that the thing is spilling. You're spilling out oxalates anyway. And so you're going to start clearing and spilling oxalates pretty quickly when you lower it. So even though in the science we say this much was the trigger dose and this much is the maintenance dose, in reality, your system has been adapting. Your system is not a petri dish. It's adapting to your situation, and it gets used to your regular exposure levels and anticipates that and is trying to adjust as much as it can. So any major change in the amount of oxalate you eat could trigger this clearing process, which can trigger new symptoms and make you feel sick.
Okay, let's take that. Let's go further into that piece. So now we need to be careful when we're clearing. And this is a subjective thing depending on how many oxalates your body is used to. Cutting that down, we're going to begin to clear. Let's take that story further and how we need to be wary to not push that too hard and cause symptoms from clearing too quickly.
Right. And again, the basic process doesn't always play out in each life the way we think of it as sort of this textbook scenario. So even if this doesn't exactly fit you, it doesn't mean it doesn't apply to you. And that's something that's hard for people to wrap their heads around. That's why this is such a frustrating topic to teach and for people to understand. I've literally had people go from a high oxalate diet to a zero oxalate diet because there's this popularity of doing an all meat diet, which has no oxalate in it. So if you're eating just animal foods, you've eliminated down to you. There is such a thing as a zero oxalate diet. That's meat. And sometimes they do fine. They don't notice the clearing illness for months and months or years. A lot of times I've had people come to me in year 3 on carnivore suddenly very sick with what is obviously oxalate illness now. I had one man interview me. I think he said he was now in his 6th year and he's seeing oxalate clearing illness now after 6 years on zero oxalate. So I mentioned those, what I consider kind of exceptions to the fact that the way this plays out is going to be quite individual. Some people are already dumping and spilling before they even start the diet. And it just doesn't make things worse to cut back because they're already so sick. But we want to do everything with as much awareness as possible so we can not let someone be doing this at a level that is dangerous. Too much oxalic acid in the blood disrupts calcium and other electrolytes, can cause heart arrhythmias and hypertension, and it makes you feel like you're having a heart attack or stroke. And you'll end up in the emergency room with an electrolyte crash, and they won't know what to do with you. They won't know what's wrong. But we can medicate that, getting some potassium and sodium and calcium in if you realize that you're doing an electrolyte crash because there's too much oxalic acid around. You can get a big inflammatory event that turns on these cytokines, which are quite harmful. And so depending on the situation, you can address that in the short run. Sometimes it's a matter of adding some more oxalate into the diet, and that seems to settle it down. Have a tea, 2 bags of tea, make a strong tea, take that, see if that helps, and so on. We can use a little vitamin C. If you're getting a big inflammatory reaction, very small amounts of vitamin C can help the immune system work better and calm down. And we didn't talk about the fact that your immune system is damaged from oxalates after every meal. The immune cells themselves get into a pro-inflammatory damaged state, and they become more confused, unable to fight infections, and so on. So there's lots of different angles that might play out in each person differently. But fundamentally, if you've gone into low oxalate and you don't feel good, adding back a small amount. And so I have a table in Toxic Superfoods, the book, that's called the dosing table. And it shows you how much carrots, if they're boiled or raw or steamed, would give you 20 or 30 milligrams of oxalate, which might be enough to help you feel better. If you've gone too low too fast and you're feeling sick, you can add back in, say, a whole cup of cooked carrots is about 30, I believe, milligrams of oxalate. And sometimes that's now therapeutic medicine to get your system to calm down. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, no, and this is important to get into. We'll use that example, the carnivore 6 years, and then starting to have symptoms of oxalates, being on a zero oxalate diet, carnivore. So if somebody decides to pump the brakes and have something like carrots, is that typically just a one-time thing? Or somebody in that position like the carnivore who's just hitting that wall at that point 6 years in, is it going to be like carrots every day for the next year to, as they're going through that clearing, to put the brakes on? You know what I'm getting at there? Is this like a
Yeah, yeah, I
one-time thing, or
do.
is it something they're going to need to use when that happens over a longer period of time?
Chances are that you're going to figure out that you're going to feel better on a certain amount of oxalate, but the body will get used to your 1 cup of carrots. If you start thinking, I just need my 1 cup of carrots with every dinner, simple solution. The body's like, oh, I know about those 30 milligrams of oxalate at dinner. I know how to not absorb them. And the body will ignore it. So going on and off of them or, changing the amount is variable. That helps keep everything alert. And you can tell if you're not getting relief, you think you're in this big episode. And the way you can tell you're in a big episode of oxalate clearing is your mood crashes, your energy crashes. Some people will see cloudy urine, which is oxalate crystals and shredded cells from the bladder coming out. Um, they'll see grit in the eyes, tartar on the teeth, gritty stools, diarrhea, skin boils. So some combination of usually some external sign plus feeling awful. You add in the tea, a lemon, some little bits of vitamin C. Usually that can help you feel better. If not, you want to try it again, do some more, and keep upping your dose of oxalate to get it to calm down. You don't have to be afraid of the trigger dose and so on. You want to get yourself out of crisis mode. And it's if you overshoot the maintenance dose that you're trying to get your body to hear the maintenance. So let's maintain, let's not clear. That's the value of understanding trigger and maintenance theory, is that you want to put enough back in to put the body into maintenance mode that tells it to stop clearing the crystals and calm down and relax. It needs a little lunch break from all that hard work it's doing.
So you began this oxalate journey 2009, had your relapse in 2013. We're 10 years later from the relapse. It sounds like you mentioned earlier having still something with your thyroid and oxalates in your spine. What I'm getting at here is, do you find you yourself at this point still need to put on the brakes sometimes? Like, it sounds like you're still clearing. Do you get into positions where you need to put on the brakes and slow that down?
A few weeks back, we had this big, what I call the solstice dump at the full moon. And I had a pretty vicious inflammation in my neck and muscles in the upper back. And I have not really needed to do dosing, as we call it, to handle my symptoms because mostly they're easy now. But that was pretty bad. And I decided what I needed more than anything, because I am very low carb, basically carnivore plus my coconut and some papaya and things like that. I needed to up some carbs to calm the kind of cortisol that goes when you're burning fat and burning too many amino acids for energy. You can lower the whole oxidative stress and the kind of cortisol level in the body by adding some carbs. So in that case, I didn't really add oxalates so much as I added more carbs. So there are times when there's some real finessing to this. But I do keep olives around and happily eat some things that have small amounts of oxalate in them. Absolutely no concern about oxalate triggering or maintenance problems. And that's the beauty of it. Once you know the big ones and you don't care to eat them anymore, you can play with these medium foods and not worry about it too much. But I would say it can be a little tricky to know what's exactly the right remedy. Usually the right remedy is get more minerals like calcium, get citric acid, and alkalize the body. Because when you're in an inflammatory state of clearing and some related symptoms like my muscle pain, there's a certain degree of acidity occurring in this interstitial gel that the cells are living in. So outside of the cell membrane, things get more acidic when there's lots of inflammation, when there's lots of oxalate moving on around. And if we can address that inflammation or address that acidity rather, that can really bring down the malaise feeling a lot. So that's another advantage of using calcium. It's chalk. Using citric acid, even acetic acid, those become basic in the body. The liver turns citric acid into bicarbonate to a certain degree, and that lowers the acidity. in the body, and that helps tremendously. You can use Alka-Seltzer Gold. There's other ways to do alkalinity with bicarbs and so on, but that can be another remedy too. So if it's not working to add 2 bites of sweet potato or a cup of carrots, sometimes what you really need to do is focus on the acidity of the crisis moment sort of thing.
I want to make sure we've covered these additional things when somebody's dumping out oxalates. So calcium, that can be helpful. Citric acid. Did you say acetic acid too?
Probably, yeah. To a
Okay.
lesser degree, yes.
And I want to come back to the calcium piece because this is a controversial supplement. A lot of times in the health and wellness space, and you do address this in your book, people are weary of calcium when it's taken as a supplement, not in food, clogging up the arteries. So for people, and myself included, I'm still a little bit weary about this one. Talk about calcium and taking that as a supplement in general, and then again for somebody who is dumping and wants to have that to help them through that. Is there anything in the science why we should be worried about supplementing with calcium?
Well, to understand calcium, the body only absorbs a certain fraction of what you take in, whether it's a supplement or in food. About 20% is the typical absorption rate of calcium. So a huge fraction of what you eat, 80% of what you eat, is staying around in the digestive tract, which is a real great advantage because that is a binder of oxalate, and that's a great place to bind oxalate. It helps the digestive tract, the colon, participate in oxalate removal from the body. So it's not all just the kidneys, because the kidneys basically have 90% of the burden of oxalate removal. And if your kidneys are worn out from this high oxalate world we're in, it's really advantageous to the body to let the colon help out, and the calcium is there as a binder. So that's the main reason we use it, is it helps the colon help you excrete oxalate. Now, in your cell environment, calcium lives in this extracellular space around the cells, and it's very well controlled inside cells. Cells have the endoplasmic reticulum and other organelles handling and managing oxalate, including mitochondria, help with this. But when a cell gets damaged from something like oxalate being nearby, the membranes no longer control calcium from sneaking into the cells. And so calcium can start leaking into damaged cells, and that's where you get aberrant calcium buildup in the body. Oxalate also follows calcium into the cells, gets in the cells anyway, actually forms within cells from vitamin C, and grabs the calcium that should be in the cells. Because calcium is this critical, what we call a secondary messenger. What it does is it tells the cell what to do. It's the messenger that tells, oh, make some insulin. Oh, bring me some sugar. Give me some more of this. Do this, as a cell. And the endoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria release little tiny blips and little bits of calcium to tell the cell what to do. But when oxalate's around, it grabs the messenger and kills the messenger. And now the cell doesn't know what to do. And the cell on the outside is getting damaged by oxalates and from the inside, and that makes them leaky to calcium. So when the body loses control of calcium and gets calcifications going, some of it's calcium oxalate buildup, it's because something is harming the control of calcium. It's not because you're absorbing too much calcium. The body tries to not absorb calcium it doesn't want. But calcium buildup is a sign of some form of toxicity in the body, not because you're taking too much calcium.
Okay. So just to be clear, taking calcium as a supplement is okay.
It's very safe. There's obviously never agreement across all the studies you pull up, and it often takes more work to find the definitive review papers that kind of broker a piece around the arguing in the literature, where you can pick some random small study and say, see, supplement killed her. When in fact, the literature suggests that there's absolutely no increases in heart attack or other forms of mortality with calcium supplementation, with or without vitamin D. But yeah, the calcium, if you're willing to listen to the whole discussion and not freak out about a few studies that suggest supplements are bad, you can be pretty relaxed about taking calcium, and I would certainly be. I'd still take calcium. I don't, calcium citrate doesn't agree with me necessarily because I'm prone to constipation. So I usually take calcium pyruvate, but I still take calcium 3 times a day.
Let's talk more about your diet. You touched on it there quickly. It sounds like it's pretty carnivore-ish. Take us through what you'd eat in a typical day. This will give us an idea of what low oxalate eating could look like.
Well, it doesn't necessarily give you a great idea because low oxalate eating can be vegan, it can be vegetarian, it can be pretty much anything. You can adopt and select low oxalate foods in and amongst any other kind of portal you want to use to define how you eat. The portal that I have to use is based on what my body is now tolerating. And this is very common problem with those of us who have poisoned ourselves with healthy eating and have oxalate crystals and long-term oxalate toxicity has deranged our gut and immune system or whatever, and our ability to eat certain foods is out the window. So I have a restricted diet because I get tired and sick on simple things like onions and, like beef now and lamb, and like I'm really limited. So I'm relying on foods that make me feel good. And that's my diet. And that happens to be for me most of the fishes. I eat a lot of tuna and sardines and other kinds of fish and shellfish. I eat a lot of pork, locally raised delicious pork primarily, and use coconut and papaya and salt and lemons here and there and lots of butter. Big fan of butter, but I don't do my raw milk and cream and don't have cheese. I think they would be perfect foods on a low oxalate diet for most people, but it doesn't seem to agree with me. And the way I know is because it turns on back facet pain. And once my back facet arthritis turns on, I don't do it because I'm trying to preserve my spine because I might need it for 3 more decades. So whatever turns on back pain, I'm not eating it.
You talked about the fact that the carnivore diet, eating meat, is a zero oxalate diet. Does that ever vary though if the animals are eating high oxalate foods? Does that ever get into the meat and then into us?
Not to appreciable amounts of oxalate, and for what testing there is. There isn't a lot of testing on seafood. We need more of it, but chances are not, especially with livestock that we're growing for food. We consume those animals when they're very young and they just haven't had enough years to accumulate oxalate. And a lot of the oxalate would be in the glands and the tendons and the bones and the kidneys, of which very few people eat. But I'm perfectly happy to eat kidney. I like kidney. And if I wasn't allergic to beef, I would eat them a lot. Sometimes I can get pork kidney. I can get kidneys from rabbits. But I wouldn't worry about animal foods being a source of oxalate. There's actually little traces, maybe even in dairy, which is surprising because of all that calcium. But the glands collect oxalate, the breasts collect oxalate. The breasts are a calcium concentrating tissue. And so oxalate tends to follow calcium around in the body. So that's probably why.
Given that our food supply has changed so much over the years through hybridization and we've made, a lot of the produce bigger and sweeter, do you have any knowledge of how oxalate content has changed as we've changed the foods?
Well, I wish there was more money for botanists to study this in light of a nutritional question like that. They're often studying it in terms of plant diseases and so on and what to do about the soil, because too much calcium and humidity will cause tomatoes to be bad because they'll fill up with oxalate crystals and that's harmful to them. So there's lots of other factors besides the breeding. Mostly we've been trying to breed plants to be less toxic because they're inherently toxic. Wild almonds will drop you dead. 15 wild almonds and you're dead of cyanide poisoning. It's like, luckily there's been both natural genetic changes and lots of selection. We've done plant selecting so intensely for thousands of years. We've developed corn on the cob. We've developed lots of potatoes. We've developed the entire produce department. There was no such thing as an edible carrot until humans invented it. And these are all progress in terms of turning vegetation into not poisonous in a more acute way. But it's also evidence that if we had to invent these foods, that they can't possibly be essential to healthy reproduction and healthy life because humans were around a lot longer than the carrot, for example.
But in all fairness, we have changed the animals a lot too through breeding. I mean, our cow these days is
Well, yeah,
probably
I
not.
don't know how much they've bred my sardines and all of that, but that's very different. We've been able to eat animals. There isn't that many toxic animals. There's a toxic snail. There's venomous snakes, there's spiders and things that are very, poisonous to us. But generally, the mammal foods that we've lived on, like the woolly mammoth and the giant sloth and the caribou and the buffalo and the reindeer and all that we've been eating, whatever breeding we've done, like we've bred the dogs to do things for us, but we haven't bred them for food. We've bred them for function, help us hunt other food. And they like the lean meat. We like the bone marrow. So we've worked out a deal with the dogs where we can hunt together and everybody's happy. So, but we are breeding animals, and that's a nice thing. Because of livestock husbandry, we're improving diversity and using them for niches. Like we've done the dogs. There's such diversity with dogs. There's great diversity in animals that we use as livestock because we have an interest in them being able to survive in Canada versus Florida versus Peru in different conditions and for different purposes for their eggs or for their meat or whatever. So we definitely breed and select animals, but it's very different than turning a wild carrot, which is bitter and tough, like tougher than leather, it's not edible in any way, shape, or form. And yet from that progeny parent plant, we've created something that we eat in any soup. Carrots, like right the basic, we use it all the time now, but it didn't exist until we invented it.
No, I agree with the plant piece, but I also think there is a lot of that with animals when it comes to like pigs versus wild boars or cows, which a lot of the carnivores are basing their whole diet or a big proportion of their diet. I mean, I'm no expert on, how things have evolved and we've bred animals, but, I don't picture cows roaming North America for us to hunt thousands of years ago. So I think, even in the meat realm, it's changed a lot the way we eat and both
Certainly
realms.
You see that in pork and chicken. Like grocery store pork is dry and tasteless. They call it the white meat because they bred it to be lower in fat and have no flavor and be tough and dry. But the more wild breeds are delicious, dark and pink and brown and, for sure very different. The chicken breast, this massive thing, didn't exist until we bred. Yeah.
So we've went deep into the science of oxalates and obviously we know your stance on them. The obvious argument somebody would bring into this case and say that they're okay or they're maybe even advantageous is hormesis. And we see that a lot in the health and wellness space. Things like saunas or cold plunging or exercise, different stressors on the body that in the right dose at the right time actually have a net health benefit. So for somebody that's saying, okay, fair enough, oxalates do exist, they're not denying that, but they're going to argue to the point that in the amount the average person is going to consume them within a healthy diet, they are neutral or even advantageous done the right way.
Well, there's so many straw men and all of that, like in a healthy diet. What is a healthy diet? A lot of us who are eating the supposed healthy diet are doing so because we're not healthy. We don't feel good. We have gut problems. We have issues. We're peeing on ourselves. We got shoulder pain. We got tooth pain. We got something going on. And so there's that. Like we like to think what we're doing is okay. Who doesn't want to think that? Right. So we come with this inherent bias that whatever we currently believe and do is right or good enough. So that makes it hard for us to think clearly about it. The other thing is the science demonstrates that a trigger dose is pretty low. And these days it's hard to stay under that trigger dose. You just don't. You're introduced to chocolate cake when you turn 1. And then you get to peanut butter sandwiches and you're given sweet potato as a first food and boiled carrots and right away, we're off to the races with chocolate, peanuts, and potatoes. By the time we're 2, we've been making them common foods that we have nearly every day. So we're growing up on foods that are novel. Peanuts and peanut butter is a brand new invention for human food. We really haven't been eating peanut butter for more than 110 years, 120 years. You may think it's normal. Anything that happened in the last 50 years, you think happened forever, but it's all pretty novel. So there isn't a good argument that we need foods like peanut butter for hormetic effects, especially since if you really want hormetic effects, do sauna, go out in the cold, jump in a snowbank, get exercise, do the things that humans used to do, rather than think that you need all these Reese's peanut butter cups and pepper flavored potato chips in order to be healthy. There's not a good argument for that.
Okay, those examples are different than, say, a turmeric supplement or using that to make a tea in the science behind that, or having green tea and some of the chemicals in that.
Yeah, the
I see
science is
those as being different
equivocal.
categories. So how do you think about those?
People could debate those too, because I don't think that in the long run that you need those either, even in the curcumin extract, low oxalate, even as low oxalate chemicals. And I mentioned there's just not enough science, but I mentioned about 3 studies in chapter 4 about when you try to give these polyphenolic compounds or take them away, the oxidative stress in the body is lower when you take them away than when you include them.
Yeah, no, I'm all for going into the science and re-navigating the way I see it. It's just most people in the health and wellness space are saying that these are superfoods. Come back to the title of your book, and it's like it's not. I don't think we can blanket statement and compare like peanut butter cups and potato chips to things like turmeric and green tea. And I just want to make sure we do justice to
Well,
giving them
even the
each their own platform.
one of those studies is a green tea study and showing that it's not helping at all. And that, see, it's equivocal because when you work on petri dishes and you put plant compounds straight on a petri dish of cells, you get a certain response. And then you make all kinds of assumptions that eating it is going to work that way in your body. But it not at all, because the tannins and the polyphenols, the body tries to disarm them and get rid of them. And the people who are experts in this say that the only way these can really be beneficial, these polyphenol compounds, is if you get the right ones for your metabolism and the right ones for your microbiome, and you have the right microbiome, then you can probably extract some benefit from it if you have all those pieces lined up. The problem is we don't know which polyphenols and which combination, which dose, and which combination of bacteria you would need to benefit. And the whole thing is this big, gigantic, impossible math problem that no computer can solve for you.
Let's stick on the microbiome piece and you talk about in the book certain species of bacteria that some people can have that can actually break down oxalates. So talk about what that is and how many people have that.
Well, there's the point of the arrow is something called Oxalobacter fermentagenes, and that there's several varieties of it, I believe, at least, maybe 3 to 6 varieties of Oxalobacter that a lot of us don't have. They're thinking that maybe up to 30% of us, 10 to 30% of us have some versions of Oxalobacter. But there are many lactobacillus bacteria and others, and there's a whole potential community of maybe 200 bacteria, maybe 2,000, but some community of bacteria can work together under different dietary and changing dietary circumstances. The kind of starch you eat, the kind of fiber you eat or don't eat will affect who grows. But they have to have this community in order to survive. They're very hard to inoculate it. There's a new group that's working on developing these commensal. They're trying to manufacture groups of commensal bacteria where you could use them as a fecal transplant and try to get this whole ecosystem to take hold and adapt to the different changes you make in your diet from day to day, to try to restore some of that, because the gut will try to excrete oxalate, and that's a way of getting rid of it.
As we talk about cutting down on these foods and them being produce and different superfoods in that realm, I can see one of the ways that people are going to go about adjusting their diet is taking in more meat. And I want to tie this into the fiber piece that we are talking about in the microbiome. Naturally, they're going to get, and again, you talked about people can do this on a vegan diet, and I want to touch on that in a minute. But if somebody goes to including more meat and cutting back on the amount of fiber for the microbiome, how do you think about that? Because fiber is a big thing in the health and wellness space right now. You talk about it being a myth in your book, so I want to hear your stance on why, if somebody is taking in less produce, less fiber, they don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, since we get very excited about certain topics, it was going to be the the DNA was going to solve everything. And once we cracked the DNA code, we'd know it all and we'd be done with illness. And now it's the microbiome. If we just crack the code of the microbiome and feed it properly and tend and feed your microbiome, all peace will break out and everything will be perfect. The problem is that we're not fermenters by nature. That's not our setup. We don't have a big enough cecum and a big enough colon to be big fermentation chambers and be relying on the fermentation of fiber for our health and well-being. And basically, bacteria don't need that much help. They need to stop being murdered by chemicals and antibacterial agents because and the high oxalate foods are promoting real problems with infectious disease and other problems with dysbiosis, where the wrong things are taking over. We have acidic, toxic bodies that allow dysbiosis to occur, where commensal things are now becoming pathologic because there's now too much yeast and too much this and that. And so you can get this endotoxemia from too much of the wrong things, but you can get endotoxemia from just too much bacteria. The bacteria put out toxins, and the body tries to garden and control how many bacteria are growing on and in the body. And by overfeeding it with just random fiber, you're fighting the body's desire to keep that under control and asking, you think more is better. We think more is better. Western culture, more spinach is better, more bacteria is better, more. Well, you can overdo feeding bacteria and make yourself quite sick. They're now blaming endotoxins that come from bacteria for dementia. And yet saying, eat a lot of fiber so you can make a lot of endotoxins so you can get dementia. Like, it's a little bit dishonest. And I think the reason it's easy to get dishonest because someone jumps to a product to promote or to sell or to manufacture. And it's easy to make tons of money selling these supplements that are full of probiotics, prebiotics, postbiotics, all this stuff on very incomplete knowledge. There's much more we don't know than we do know. And you're hearing this because they're pushing products as much as anything, and a philosophy that I'm not sure why people want to be fermentation chambers. I'm not sure why I want to be bloated and farting all the time, but feel free to do that. I just wouldn't recommend it.
Up until this point, we focused heavily on oxalates and more of a chronic situation where we're taking them in over time and they're accumulating in the body.
Right.
What happens when we come back to that smoothie we talked about earlier? The fact that somebody could make a smoothie these days with, a nut butter in there, an almond butter, almond milk, and spinach, and say they're getting this massive hit of oxalates in the morning for breakfast. So what I'm getting at with this is acute versus chronic. And we know that we've talked about acute from a trigger perspective, but just as hitting the body with this big bolus of oxalates, what can that do to us acutely?
Boy, it's frightening. It's a big load of poison. It's probably 1 gram or more of oxalate in a smoothie, all dressed up in the duds of like a little turmeric and all that. A whole gram, this is like 8 times what you can handle. Immediately within 40 minutes, your immune cells are damaged. So your chance of contracting an infection or aggravating your current infection go up. So your chance of getting sick that day of the smoothie go up. And your chance of having a headache or having some kind of neurological problem, having trouble remembering stuff, becoming clumsy and klutzy, and these might be signs of this neurotoxicity. If you're suddenly dropping things, can't hold on to your key, can't get it in the door, bump into the door frame, drop your glass because you missed the edge of the table, your eye-hand coordination's off. Your vision might change. You might find your night vision that night isn't so good. Or even your ability to really focus is like delayed or something like that. You might get tooth pain. You might get heart arrhythmias or a shoulder pain, or you might leak on yourself when you're running to the bathroom and have a little trouble controlling your urine. You might wake up that night in the middle of the night having to pee, having to run to the bathroom a lot of times. There's potentially some symptoms that can occur in the wake of the smoothie. Hopefully there are, because then you can put it together. If you know to think about, oops, the smoothie actually might be a problem, not this. Because we live so strongly through beliefs and placebo effect. The ritual of putting together the perfect smoothie and being right there, right up to date on how to eat can take you far. Like you're so proud of yourself that you can overlook the fact that you're leaking on yourself and bumping into the door frame.
Up until this point, we focused heavily on oxalates, but we have touched on other plant chemicals, the polyphenols, phytic acid, lectins. How do you think about some of these other compounds? Obviously, the focus of your book is oxalates, but you do touch on some of these other ones. So what I'm getting at is how do you look at some of these other chemicals in addition to oxalates?
Well, I think it's important to be aware that things like the compounds in the cabbage family, which is a low oxalate group of foods, the cabbage and all its friends, a huge number of vegetables come from the cabbage family, that they're better off cooked. Like if you cook them, you can disarm the stuff that gets transformed in the gut into something that damages your thyroid gland. And you're better off not eating mountains of them. And that's true for many plants, that there's enough of these chemicals. Honestly, they can't help but be a little toxic. They have to create a chemical self-defense in order for them to have dormant seeds that know when to generate and become germinating plants, seeds that are disagreeable to critters, and leaves and bark and so on to protect the plants. Because if they weren't able to commit some kind of chemical self-defense, they wouldn't exist. They would have been herbated out of existence. So really, one of the messages is, please start paying attention to oxalate. And then you'll start to be able to hear from your body how much of these other lower oxalate foods you can handle, and start to improve your digestion and your sleep and your energy by being willing to question the amount that your body can tolerate. Just have an agreement to start listening to your body over time, continuing to be servant to the messages your body are sending back to you, and not just insist that you should eat the right way that we're being taught and demand that your body function properly under the regime of our current belief system, versus having a more friendly relationship and respect with your body's feedback.
As I brought up the different plant compounds and how they can be toxic to the body, it gets me thinking about the synergy. And obviously, this would be really tough for science to pick apart and see how they react together. But you'd have to imagine that in the body, when we're having all these different plant chemicals in one bolus, that synergy can't be a good thing.
It can create lots of different stresses. And really, my research on the plant compounds and their effects in the body, it seemed like all the studies are saying this compound harms the gut, this compound harms the gut, this compound harms the gut. It seems like the gut is, very complex, important central system in the body that the plants are all happy to get. It seems like if you don't have good gut health, you should be questioning the plants you're eating.
And let's come back to the vegan piece. Obviously, if somebody wants to adopt a diet like that, or vegetarian, heavy in plants, they would want to avoid the big hitters that we talked about earlier. But it still seems to me that it would be so challenging to keep that oxalate level when you're eating that amount of plants and grains, and it would just add up so quickly. So what advice would you give to somebody following that kind of diet to help guide them and keep the oxalates down?
Well, it's similar advice. Like you can live without the spinach and the buckwheat and the quinoa and the chia seeds. Get rid of those. Like the chia bowls got to go. But if you're willing to cook at home, I think most vegans and vegetarians know they have to cook at home a lot. So that's an easy thing for them to switch and do black-eyed peas and chickpeas instead of the other kinds of the beans. Just know to do the soaking and the high-pressure cooking and get away from this raw thing, like raw veganism. And especially if you need to be plant-based keto is just so toxic because you can't live without the nuts and the beans. So you cannot really, in the long run, thrive on a plant-based keto diet. But you can do a starch-based vegetarian diet using peas and chickpeas and black-eyed peas and rice and, some fruits and some vegetables. So you can do that. I think it's hard to get enough protein. It's hard to get enough vitamin A and enough of the full complement of nutrients that we need. But if you could get away from the high oxalate foods, that your gout and your stuff may get better, your sleep might get better, your brain might be happier, and it might give you that kind of whatever it is shift you need to let yourself have some eggs or some cheese, which would be a great addition to a vegetarian diet, or some sardines. Seafood, and especially sardines, are loaded with omega-3s, fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin D, calcium. It's a way to start really getting some concentrated nutrients into the diet. But if you could just quit the chia balls and the buckwheat, that would be a big start.
For somebody that's tuned into this point, whatever kind of diet they're on and are going to continue as they try and lower their oxalates, are there any specific adjuncts that they can put in to help through the process of dumping them out? So what my head goes to is things like zeolites and different clays, which might help pull them out of the body, or might help when we start dumping into the body if we start having symptoms. Is there any science showing that those or other compounds that we can include can help facilitate an easier dumping?
Well, one of the compounds that's really seems to help a lot is citric acid, which is lemon juice. So I highly recommend using lemon juice and juicing like 1.5 lemons twice a day. So at least 3 lemons a day could be really good medicine, because citric acid will sit on the oxalate crystals and soften them up and turn them more chalky. Instead of being hard like quartz, it softens them up and it makes it easier for the body to break them apart. It also does that alkalization that you need to correct the acidity that all this dumping and inflammation is causing. So it helps you alkalize, it helps you break up the stones, it helps you prevent kidney stones, because one of the dangers of clearing oxalate out of even your kidney is that you could end up with kidney stones. Because you're going low oxalate, you're at a rush to get stuff, things are trying to get out the exit doors all of a sudden. And so doing the lemon juice twice a day can really help protect you from kidney stones. So I highly recommend that. Is between calcium, that's why calcium citrate is such an important therapeutic thing to use, and start taking, say, 250 milligrams of calcium citrate at bedtime and see how you do on that. Sometimes the calcium promotes the dumping because it's a binder. Things that help you get out increases the toxicity of it moving out too fast. The thing is, you want it to move out slowly. You don't want to push it fast. You don't want to do things that push it. So things like pulsed electromagnetic therapies can open up ion channels and make you sick. It will facilitate the clearing, but you don't want it to go fast, because dose makes the poison. So if you're unleashing a lot of the dose out of your tissues quickly, it's more poisonous on your bloodstream, your capillaries. Now, you need capillaries to keep your vision, right? You need blood cells to be healthy. So you don't want to poison your blood cells or your kidneys or your bladder. So slower is better. So you don't necessarily need to push. The body wants to get rid of it. It does. You can trust that the body wants to get rid of it, and it will, if you lower your amount and then do some support with minerals. Potassium, sodium is surprisingly helpful too. Getting enough electrolytes, replenishing them over and over again every day, getting citric acid, getting calcium. It's too simple. People want to intervene more than that. They want to get all the fancy, expensive zeolites and all that. And there may be heavy metals in your crystals of oxalate. So you might get mercury mobilization, aluminum, you name it. Heavy metals will probably be being released at the same time. So there may be times when it makes great sense to have zeolite and clay in your program.
Got it. And what about things like using the sauna, going for walks, lifestyle modalities that can help the process?
Very critical. Very critical. Sauna is my all-time favorite thing for lowering inflammation, improving endorphin levels, improving your blood flow, improving your skin excretion of all things. I highly recommend frequent short sauna and fitting that in as often as you can. Cold showers. I haven't had a hot shower in maybe 4 years now. I love them. They're really, again, it's a sort of endorphins thing that just helps your whole system work better. And getting outside in the daylight, going out in bare feet. These are all fantastic ways to support your system's ability to keep the ship up, straight up, and be able to sleep enough and be able to function during the day. All those are great. Getting mild exercise and keeping it reasonable, not pushing to the limit, being inside your capacity, listening for what your up for today and honoring that so that you don't over push. Because if you over exercise, jump around on a trampoline a lot, keep the tissue massages, do all these therapies, you can stir up things and your system may not be ready to cope with all of that.
A big part of the message today that we want to be patient, take our time with this, not rush it. And it can be a multi-year process. And I would assume it would be an ongoing process because we're going to continue to make oxalates and bring them in through the diet. Even if we're aware, it's still going to be part of our life. So it's not going anywhere.
It's not going anywhere. You're absolutely right. We just need to be aware of it, be patient, trust the body, and start respecting the potential toxicity that we're facing. And I'm hoping that more and more people will be aware of it when they're trying to get pregnant, have healthy pregnancies, do breastfeeding, and raise children, because these are very precious times in life that you can't redo. And oxalate is potentially interfering with effective growth and development of young children.
It's common knowledge the importance of drinking a lot of water and keeping hydrated. But as somebody who is going to be dumping and pulling oxalates out of the body and hopefully getting them out of the body, how important does hydration become?
Yeah, and you want to hydrate in ways that gets to the tissues. So I recommend mineral water, salted water. The minerals help to pull the fluids into the tissues because if you just run water through your body, just purified water, it just is a lot of water coming out through the kidneys. And that's actually not helpful to the kidneys, even though we like to dilute the urine enough so it's not overly concentrated. You're actually overworking the kidneys by overdoing the water if it's not mineral water.
Okay. It just as we're thinking about, expelling these from the body and helping the body with that process, hydration comes to mind. So
It's very important,
adding things to the water though, that's a key piece.
very important. So if you're, and the body actually does this for you too. When you're clearing oxalates, you tend to have higher volume of urine. The body is looking for water to help flush out the oxalates. And if your body's peeing out more, it should increase your thirst. So hopefully your thirst is giving you clues. You got to drink.
Sally, really enjoyed the conversation. This is a really unique one, really important topic, and I appreciate the work you're putting out into the world. We're going to link up your book below in the show notes, Toxic Superfoods. We're going to link up your website, your social media, everything, so people can continue this research and continue to learn, and I thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. It's so fun to be with you, and I appreciate you helping people to learn a little bit about oxalates. Thank you.
Now that you're done my conversation with Sally, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Anthony. He talks about how plants are toxic and they're trying to kill you. I'll see you over there.
No animal eats the variety of plants that we do, and I think that that's causing and driving most of them.